The fire that took Margaret Blackmore's husband 4 years ago had also taken half her face, leaving behind a tapestry of scars that told a story of survival she kept hidden beneath a dark veil, until the day a mysterious cowboy with eyes like summer storms rode into the dusty town of Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory, 1878, changing everything she thought she knew about beauty, love, and acceptance. Margaret adjusted her black veil carefully as she stepped out of her modest dress shop onto the sun-baked street of Redemption Creek. 4 years as a widow had taught her to move through the world like a shadow seen but never truly noticed. The left side of her face remained carefully concealed beneath layers of dark fabric, a barrier between her scars and the world's judgment. "Morning, Mrs. Blackmore," called Mr. Peterson from the general store. "Fine day, isn't it?" Margaret nodded politely. The townsfolk had grown accustomed to her presence over the years. The quiet widow who kept to herself, made the finest dresses in 3 counties, and never removed her veil in public. Some whispered about what lay beneath, but most had the decency not to ask. She made her way toward the post office, her boots stirring up dust from the dry Arizona street. The summer of 1878 had been particularly harsh, with drought threatening the local ranches and tempers running as hot as the midday sun. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention. Riders were common enough in Redemption Creek, but something about the lead horseman made Margaret pause. He sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders outlined against the brilliant blue sky. Unlike most cowboys passing through, he wore a crisp white shirt beneath his leather vest, and his dark hat looked new and well-shaped. As the riders drew closer, Margaret stepped back toward the boardwalk, giving them space to pass. She lowered her head slightly, a habitual gesture to ensure her veil stayed in place. The lead rider pulled his horse to a stop directly in front of her, dust swirling around his mount's legs. "Pardon me, madam," came a deep voice, gentle despite its resonance. "Might you direct me to Sheriff Taylor's office?" Margaret looked up, her gaze meeting eyes the color of a stormy sky. The man was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, with a strong jaw, shadowed with stubble and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long days under the western sun. "3 buildings down on your right, sir," she replied, her voice soft from disuse. She rarely engaged in lengthy conversations with strangers. The cowboy touched the brim of his hat. "Much obliged." His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than was customary, but without the morbid curiosity she'd grown accustomed to. "Name's Grant Xavier. Just brought a herd up from Texas with my men." "Margaret Blackmore," she replied, surprising herself with the offering of her name. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Blackmore." He smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. Then he clicked to his horse and continued down the street, his men following behind. Margaret watched him go, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. It had been a long time since a man had truly looked at her without pity or discomfort. The next morning, Margaret was arranging bolts of fabric when the bell above her shop door chimed. She turned, expecting Mrs. Hudson coming for her daughter's wedding dress fitting. Instead, Grant Xavier filled the doorway, his tall frame seeming too large for her small shop. "Mr. Xavier," she said, unable to hide her surprise. "Mrs. Blackmore." He removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. How may I help you?" She kept her hands busy with the fabric, a nervous habit. He stepped further into the shop, glancing around at the dresses displayed on mannequins and the colorful fabrics lining the walls. "I've been told you're the finest seamstress in these parts. People are kind to say so." "I need some shirts made. Lost most of my belongings crossing the Gila River." He smiled ruefully. "Turns out it's not always as dry as folks claim." Margaret nodded. "I can help with that. When do you need them by? I'll be in town at least a month." "Selling cattle and buying more before heading back to Texas." He approached her counter. "No rush." She reached for her measuring tape. "I'll need to take your measurements." Grant stood perfectly still as Margaret worked, her hands moving efficiently around his broad shoulders and chest. She was acutely aware of his steady breathing and the clean scent of soap that surrounded him, unusual for a man who just completed a cattle drive. "You've been in Redemption Creek long?" he asked as she measured his arm length. "4 years," she replied, focusing on the numbers rather than the firm muscle beneath her fingers. "Came alone." The question, innocent enough, touched on wounds deeper than those visible on her face. "My husband died shortly after we arrived." Grant's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Blackmore. Thank you." She stepped back, finished with her measurements. 3 shirts, you said? 3 would be fine." He watched her write down the numbers in her ledger. "If you don't mind my asking, what brought you and your husband to Redemption Creek?" Margaret rarely spoke of Thomas or their dreams, but something about Grant's genuine interest compelled her to answer. "Thomas had mining interests. We came from Boston with hopes of making our fortune." She smiled sadly behind her veil. "We were young and full of grand ideas." "The best kind to have," Grant said. "I've had a few myself." "And what brings a Texas cattleman so far west?" "Opportunity. Drought's been bad in Texas. Heard Arizona's got better prices and new railroads coming." He placed his hat back on his head. "Sometimes a man needs to see what's over the next hill." Margaret nodded. "Your shirts should be ready in a week, Mr. Xavier." "Grant, please." He smiled again. "And I look forward to it, Mrs. Blackmore." After he left, Margaret stood motionless in her shop, trying to understand the flutter in her chest. It had been so long since she'd engaged in conversation that wasn't purely transactional, even longer since she'd felt the stirring of attraction. Over the next week, Margaret found her thoughts drifting to Grant Xavier as she worked on his shirts. She selected her finest cotton, taking extra care with each stitch. It was foolish, she knew. A man like him, handsome, confident, whole, would never look twice at a scarred widow. The conversation had been nothing more than common courtesy. When Grant returned to collect his shirts, Margaret had them wrapped neatly in brown paper. "These are perfect," he said, examining her work with genuine appreciation. "Finest stitching I've ever seen." "Thank you." She accepted his payment, careful to avoid touching his hand. Instead of leaving, Grant lingered. "There's a social at the church Saturday evening. Thought you might like to attend." Margaret stiffened. "I don't go to socials, Mr. Xavier." "Grant," he corrected gently. "And why not?" "Seems to me a town this size needs all its members to make a gathering worthwhile." "I prefer my own company," she said, her tone final. Grant studied her for a long moment. "Sometimes what we prefer isn't what we need, Mrs. Blackmore." He placed his hat on his head. "Think about it." After he left, Margaret pressed her hands to the counter to steady herself. How dare he presume to know what she needed? He knew nothing of the stares, the whispers, the children who pointed and asked loudly what was wrong with her face. Yet as Saturday approached, Margaret found herself standing before her wardrobe, fingering a blue dress she hadn't worn in years. The fabric was still good, if a little outdated. She could easily update the trim. "This is madness," she muttered, closing the wardrobe firmly. She would not go to the social. She would not subject herself to the discomfort of others just because a handsome cowboy had shown her basic kindness. Saturday evening arrived, and Margaret sat alone in her small house behind the shop, a book open on her lap. The words blurred before her eyes as she strained to hear the distant sounds of music and laughter from the church hall. A knock at her door startled her. She hesitated, then rose to answer it. Grant Xavier stood on her porch, hat in hand. "Good evening, Mrs. Blackmore, Mr. Xavier." "What are you doing here? Thought I'd check if you needed an escort to the social." His eyes held no pity, only warm invitation. "I told you I don't attend such functions, and I wondered if perhaps you might reconsider." He gestured to the night air. "It's a fine evening for a walk at the very least." Margaret's hand tightened on the door. "People will stare, let them." His voice was gentle but firm. "Been my experience that folks only have the power we give them." "You don't understand," she whispered. "Then help me to." He extended his hand. "Just a walk, Margaret, nothing more." The use of her given name sent a shiver through her. How long had it been since anyone had called her Margaret in that way, like she was a woman, not just a tragedy? A walk, she agreed finally, reaching for her shawl and securing her veil. They strolled through the quiet streets, the evening air cool against Margaret's skin. Grant didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless chatter, and gradually she felt herself relax. "How long will you stay in Redemption Creek?" she asked eventually. "Depends on business and other factors." He glanced at her. "I like it here. Reminds me of where I grew up before my family moved to Texas." "Which was where?" "Small town in Missouri, place called Liberty," he chuckled. Ironic name, considering how constrained it felt growing up there. "And Texas provided the freedom you sought, in some ways." He guided her around a puddle left from yesterday's brief rain. "Space to breathe, at least, to make my own decisions, good or bad." They had reached the church hall. Light spilled from its windows and the sound of a fiddle drifted out into the night. Margaret hesitated. "We don't have to go in," Grant said, reading her reluctance. "But I'd be honored if you'd dance with me, Margaret Blackmore," her heart hammered in her chest. "I haven't danced in years." "Then it's high time you remembered how," he offered his arm. "One dance. Then I'll walk you home if you wish." Something in his steadfast gaze gave her courage. Margaret took his arm and allowed him to lead her toward the hall. Conversations faltered as they entered. Margaret felt the weight of curious stares, heard the whispers behind raised hands. Her grip tightened on Grant's arm. "Eyes on me," he murmured, leading her directly to the dance floor where several couples were already moving to the music. Margaret followed his lead, her body remembering steps she thought long forgotten. Grant's hand was warm and strong against her waist, his movements confident as he guided her through the dance. "See, not so terrible," he said, smiling down at her. "The dancing isn't," she admitted. "It's everything else. Pay them no mind. Most folks are just surprised to see the mysterious Mrs. Blackmore socializing." "Is that what they call me? Mysterious, among other things, elegant, talented, standoffish." She nearly missed a step. "Standoffish, can you blame them?" His eyes twinkled. "You've kept yourself apart for 4 years." The music ended and Grant led her to the refreshment table. He fetched them each a cup of punch, standing close as if to shield her from curious onlookers. Sheriff Taylor approached, nodding respectfully. "Mrs. Blackmore, good to see you out and about." "Mr. Xavier?" "Sheriff," Grant acknowledged. "Hope you're enjoying your stay in our town, Xavier. Your cattle business seems to be booming." "Can't complain." Grant's hand found the small of Margaret's back. "Found more here than I expected." The sheriff's eyes flickered between them, curious but polite. "Well, enjoy the evening, folks." As the night progressed, Margaret found herself relaxing incrementally. Grant introduced her to the cowboys from his outfit, treated her with such natural respect that others began to follow his lead. By the time he walked her home, she felt lighter than she had in years. "Thank you," she said as they reached her door, "for persuading me to come. The pleasure was mine." He hesitated, then added, "I'd like to call on you properly, Margaret, if you'd permit it." She tensed. "To what end, Mr. Xavier?" "To know you better." His honesty was disarming. "I find myself thinking about you when I should be focusing on cattle prices. You know nothing about me. I know you're brave, skilled with a needle, have a dry sense of humor you try to hide." His smile was gentle. "I'd like to discover the rest." Margaret turned away. "You don't want that, Grant, trust me. Shouldn't I be the judge of what I want? Not when you don't have all the facts." Her hand went instinctively to her veil, understanding dawned in his eyes. "The scars don't matter to me, Margaret." "You haven't seen them," she whispered. "I don't need to." He stepped closer. "But when you're ready to show me, I'll still be here." He left her standing on her porch, confused and aching with a longing she'd thought dead and buried alongside Thomas. Over the following weeks, Grant became a regular visitor to Margaret's shop. He brought her wildflowers gathered from the creek bank, shared stories of his cattle drives, and gradually coaxed her into telling him about her life before the fire, her childhood in Philadelphia, her love of books, her dreams of seeing California someday. The town noticed. Margaret caught the speculative glances, heard the whispers. Most seemed pleased to see the lonely widow finding companionship, though some wondered what a handsome cattleman saw in a woman who hid her face from the world. One afternoon, Grant invited her to a picnic by the creek. Against her better judgment, Margaret agreed. They sat beneath a cottonwood tree, sharing bread, cheese, and dried apple slices as clouds drifted lazily overhead. "Tell me about the fire," Grant said finally, his voice gentle. Margaret stiffened. They had carefully avoided this topic until now. "You don't have to," he added, "but I'd like to understand." She gazed at the creek, gathering her courage. "It was night. A lamp overturned in the hotel where we were staying until our house could be built. Thomas got me out, then went back for others." Her voice faltered. "The building collapsed before he could escape." Grant's hand covered hers. "I'm sorry. I was trapped briefly, burning debris." Her fingers touched her veil. "The doctor said I was lucky to keep my ear, lucky." She laughed bitterly. "You were," Grant said softly. "Not because of what you lost, but because you survived to build a new life. Many wouldn't have had your strength." Margaret turned to him, studying his face. "Why are you doing this, Grant? Why me when you could have any woman in town? Because none of them are you." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek through the veil. "Because from the moment I saw you, I recognized something in you that called to me. Pity," she suggested harshly. "Strength," he corrected. "Dignity, beauty that has nothing to do with what can be seen." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "You can't mean that." "I've never meant anything more." He leaned forward and with exquisite gentleness pressed his lips to her veiled cheek. "I'm falling in love with you, Margaret Blackmore, and nothing under that veil could change that." That night, Margaret stood before her mirror, trembling fingers on her veil. For the first time in years, she removed it deliberately, forcing herself to look at what remained of the left side of her face. The puckered skin, the uneven texture, the way her lip pulled slightly upward on that side. Grant's words echoed in her mind. Could he possibly accept this? Could anyone? The next day, Margaret avoided the shop, sending a note that she was indisposed. She did the same the following day. On the third day, Grant appeared at her home door, concern evident in his features. "Are you ill?" he asked when she answered, veil firmly in place. "No," she couldn't meet his eyes. "I just needed time to think. About us." "There is no us, Grant. There can't be." His jaw tightened. "Because you've decided, or because you're afraid." "Because I'm realistic," she snapped. "Whatever you imagine is under this veil, the reality is worse." "Then show me." His voice was steady. "If you want me to leave you alone, Margaret, show me your face and tell me you feel nothing for me." Her heart pounded painfully. "That's cruel." "No. What's cruel is pushing away someone who loves you without giving them a chance." He stepped closer. "I'm not Thomas. I won't leave you." The mention of her husband's name broke something in Margaret. "You know nothing about leaving. Thomas didn't choose to die." "And I'm not choosing to walk away now," Grant said firmly. "But you're choosing to hide." They stood in tense silence, the truth of his words hanging between them. "I'm scared," Margaret finally whispered. Grant's expression softened. "I know, but I'm right here." With shaking hands, Margaret reached for her veil. She hesitated, then slowly lifted it back over her hat, exposing her face completely for the first time in his presence. She kept her eyes downcast, unable to watch his reaction. The silence stretched between them, unbearable. "Margaret," Grant said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Look at me." Gathering her courage, she raised her eyes to his. Instead of the disgust or pity she feared, she saw only tenderness and tears gathering in his gray eyes. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me with this." He stepped forward and, with infinite gentleness, traced the line where smooth skin met scarred tissue. Margaret trembled at his touch but didn't pull away. "Beautiful," he murmured. "Every inch of you is beautiful to me." Then he leaned down and pressed his lips to her scarred cheek in a kiss so tender it broke her heart and healed it simultaneously. "I love you," he said against her skin, "and I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Margaret's tears flowed freely now. "How can you be certain?" "You've only known me a short time. Some things a man just knows." He smiled, cupping her face in his hands. "Say you'll marry me, Margaret Blackmore. People will talk," she warned, even as hope bloomed in her chest. "Let them. We'll be too busy being happy to notice." 3 weeks later, they stood together before the reverend in the same church hall where they had first danced. Margaret wore a cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, her veil replaced by a small hat with a modest face netting that obscured but didn't completely hide her features. Grant's men were there, alongside the townsfolk who had come to support the widow who had finally emerged from her solitude. Margaret still felt the weight of curious glances, but Grant's steady presence beside her made them bearable. As they exchanged vows, Margaret's voice grew stronger with each promise. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Grant turned to her with such love in his eyes that she forgot everyone else in the room. "May I?" he asked softly, gesturing to her hat. Understanding his intention, Margaret nodded, her heart racing. Grant carefully removed her hat and netting, exposing her face to the congregation. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Margaret kept her eyes on her husband. "I love all of you," Grant said, loud enough for those nearest to hear. Then, with deliberate tenderness, he began to kiss her face, first her unmarked right cheek, then crossing to press his lips to each part of her scarred left side. Her temple, her cheekbone, the corner of her eye, the place where her ear had partially survived, the edge of her lip that never quite closed properly. Each kiss was a benediction, an acceptance, a declaration before witnesses that her scars were part of her, not something to hide or fear. By the time he reached her lips for a proper wedding kiss, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. Afterward, during the celebration, Margaret was surprised by how many people approached her not with pity but with genuine congratulations and, from some of the women, admissions of their own hidden scars, whether physical or emotional. "You've changed this town, Mrs. Xavier," Sheriff Taylor told her as he offered his good wishes. "Reminded us all what courage looks like." Later that night, in the privacy of the home they would now share, Margaret stood before Grant without any coverings or shadows to hide behind. "I still don't understand what you see when you look at me," she admitted. Grant took her hands in his. "I see the woman who rebuilt her life after unimaginable loss, who creates beauty with her hands every day, who dared to love again despite her fears." He kissed her gently. "I see my wife, my partner, my future." Margaret leaned into his embrace, feeling truly seen for the first time in years. "I love you, Grant Xavier. And I love every part of you, Margaret Xavier." Over the following months, Margaret gradually stopped wearing her veil altogether. There were still stares sometimes, particularly from strangers passing through town, but she found herself increasingly able to meet them with dignity rather than shame. Grant's cattle business flourished, and he built Margaret a larger shop on the main street, with living quarters above that, gave them a view of both the mountains and the creek that gave the town its name. At his encouragement, she expanded her business to include ready-made clothing, and even hired an assistant, a young widow named Sarah, who had children to support. When Margaret discovered she was expecting a child the following spring, her first reaction was fear that her baby might somehow be marked by her scars, fear that pregnancy might further damage her already fragile skin. Grant held her through these worries, reminding her of her strength. "Our child will be beautiful," he assured her, "and will grow up knowing that true beauty comes from within." Their daughter, born in the winter of 1879, had Grant's stormy gray eyes and Margaret's determined chin. They named her Hope for what she represented to both of them. As Redemption Creek grew alongside the new railroad, so did the Xavier's place in the community. Grant's cattle ranch expanded, and Margaret's dress shop became known throughout the territory for its quality and style. She specialized in creating clothes for women with physical differences, adjustments for missing limbs, clever designs to accommodate wheelchair users, and garments that allowed women with scars like hers to feel beautiful rather than hidden. On their 5th anniversary, Grant surprised Margaret by taking her to San Francisco, fulfilling her long-held dream of seeing California. They stood together on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, the wind whipping Margaret's now unveiled face. "Regrets?" Grant asked, his arm around her waist. Margaret shook her head, watching 7-year-old Hope collecting shells on the beach below, her laughter carried up by the wind. "Not one. Even when I made you face your fears in front of the whole town," she smiled, turning to face her husband. The years had added streaks of silver to his dark hair, laugh lines around his eyes, but his gaze still held the same steadfast love that had given her the courage to remove her veil. "Especially then," she said, touching his cheek. "You taught me that some scars are meant to be worn proudly, evidence that we survived." Grant leaned down to kiss her, his lips finding each mark on her face with the same reverence he had shown on their wedding day. "And some love stories," he murmured against her skin, "are written in scars." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the California sun on her uncovered face. Ours certainly was. As they made their way back down to join their daughter, Margaret reflected on how far she had come from that veiled widow who had hidden in the shadows of Redemption Creek. The scars remained, would always remain, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they were simply part of a greater story, one of loss and recovery, of hiding and being found, of a love brave enough to see beyond surface wounds to the beauty that endured beneath.